The last hero, Bran the Builder, and the Night's King are three figures of legend in A Song of Ice and Fire, all of them featuring in Old Nan's stories that she tells to Bran. All of them have also featured pretty heavily in videos I've recently put out on the channel, and that's got me thinking a lot about them. The Age of Heroes is a time that's shrouded in mystery, but at the same time, it's a time that Bran, with his Weirwood powers of green dreams and viewing the past, and all the stories he's heard of the Age of Heroes, may go back and try take a look at. When I was thinking about these characters, I was trying to figure out what, if anything, about them would be relevant for Bran to go back and see, and I came to a bit of a conclusion that at first I thought, oh, wouldn't it be kind of funny if this happened? And then I thought about it, I'm like, oh, no, wait a minute, that would actually be perfect if that happened. That would be like one of the clearest ways to get across the message that I think Bran needs to get. So, today we're going to talk about it. A lot of the relevant stuff about Bran the Builder I've talked about in detail in recent videos, so I'll quickly summarize the main points here, assuming most of you have probably seen that. If you haven't, don't worry, you can go check it out after this, I'll make sure you understand enough of what you need to know. The first main point is the real Bran the Builder, the founder of House Stark, was someone who was likely around at the time of the Pact, when the war with the Children of the Forest ended, because that's likely when the new ruling dynasty that's centered around Weirwood magic would be founded, when everyone started worshipping the Weirwoods and the new era of peace began. The other person who it only makes sense to have existed at this time in history is the last hero, because he's the one who supposedly sought out the aid of the Children of the Forest and brought an end to the Long Night. Considering, as we've talked about recently, we have really good evidence that the Children of the Forest were casting others in their war with the First Men, turning the trees into warriors, it seems like at the very least there was an others type long night going on at the end of this war, and then this somehow was ended by the last hero working with the Children of the Forest. This makes perfect sense that that would lead to a pact where they meet with the Children of the Forest and finally put down their arms and end this war. So someone seeks out the aid of the Children of the Forest, apparently makes some deal with them or works with them somehow, and this leads to a pact with them and humanity, and then someone, after this pact, has their entire dynasty seemingly magically kept in charge for 10,000 years. Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and guess those were the same person. Bran the Builder is pretty likely to be the last hero to me. The guy who saved Westeros from the first long night. The other important bit of speculation that I've made about Bran the Builder is that he's probably quite a bit like the Brandon Stark that we see in our story. He's talking to the Children of the Forest, he's doing some strange Weirwood magic seemingly, he's growing magically powerful, and he seems a lot more accomplished than our Bran. So, it wouldn't be that unreasonable, in my opinion, if he is also using this Weirwood magic to extend his life to achieve many of these great deeds. This is just like straightforward in my opinion. He's connected to the Children of the Forest and their magic flows through the Weirwoods' magic is used to strap up powerful bodies to and extend their life forever. We see it on display with Bloodraven, he's lingering long past his years that he should be. He explains how it works to Bran, and Bran is promised that he's gonna linger on long after all of his friends are gone, and he doesn't like that idea. And we see deep down in the caves that there are bodies who have been there for a long, long time that are still alive. In my opinion, it would almost be weird if Bran the Builder wasn't extending his life at least quite a bit. Our Bran has barely met the Children of the Forest, and they're already working on trying to hook him up to the Weirwoods and extend his life. I don't know why we as a fandom don't assume they would have done the exact same thing with Bran the Builder. To me, that seems like it would be the most likely option. Like, imagine if we had Bran extending his life and looking back through time at Bran the Builder, who is working with the Children of the Forest in the Weirwoods. We would straight up require an explanation as to why he isn't doing the same thing. That would be like one of the things that we would wonder. So, unless we get that explanation, he probably was. Another thing that I've always noticed is suspiciously absent in the Bran the Builder legends is any stories about how he died or what they did when he died. Like we hear about what happened when some ancient Starks died. When the guy who built all the ships dies, they burn all the ships. Like we get stories, right? There's nothing, not a peep, about when Bran the Builder died, how anyone reacted to his death. For the greatest Stark of all time, I always felt that was a little bit weird. Where are the legends of all the dire wolves howling all night the day that Bran the Builder finally died, or all the long procession as they led him down into the crypts and laid him to rest? Like, unless I've completely missed it somewhere, there is nothing. I've talked in the past about how this might be because Bran the Builder to this day down in the crypts is still alive in the roots in the same way we see those other bodies, but today I'd also like to present an added layer of an explanation that could work whether you believe Bran the Builder is dead or whether you believe he's still alive. All of that groundwork, I think, is pretty firm stuff that all really stands up. But this is now where I'm going to get a little bit more speculative, and I do want to point out this theory overall is something that I'm pitching as speculation that I kind of really like and was interested what other people think of it. Not necessarily something that I'm like planting my flag as like this has to be true. That's not really how I present any theory, but just to make it clear, this one is a little extra speculative, as any of these are when we're dealing with like super ancient Age of Heroes stuff. But the interesting thing that I would now like to point out is assuming that Bran the Builder has an extended life of some sort, there is another tradition in Westeros where noble old ways worshipping families, once they have an heir that's ready to take over the throne, the father will take the black. The most obvious example of this is, of course, Lord Commander Jeor Mormont. The guy who's in charge of the wall when we get there is someone who's done just this. Basically, he's decided, you know what, I'm pretty old, I've been in charge for long enough, it's probably time that my son takes over and gets to rule for a little bit. So he gives up his titles to his son and takes the black so that the rest of his family can start ruling and he can spend the rest of his days up on the wall. Now, assuming that Bran the Builder is someone who would have ruled for quite a long time, he would have made sure everything was established, but maybe eventually he did want to pass on his kingdom to his descendants. Well, maybe taking the black is also a good way for Bran the Builder, who may be immortal or at least living for hundreds of years. Maybe that's a good way that he could do that. For Northern Lords who choose to do this, it seems like basically a controlled succession at what they view to be the right time. And if Bran the Builder's living long past what a normal person would, this is something that would make sense for him. So if we're speculating, several decades after the Night's Watch is founded, Winterfell is established, Bran the Builder's ruled for a long time, he goes off and joins the Night's Watch, well, another thing that's safe to speculate is if Bran the freaking Builder joins the Night's Watch, they're gonna eventually make him Lord Commander, probably pretty quickly. Probably as soon as the first one that's there dies. And you do kind of have to wonder if the timing would work out correctly from when the wall was founded to when Bran the Builder would have maybe gotten to it for him to be the 13th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. And now you know where we're going with this. If he's the 13th Lord Commander, that would make him the Night's King. And you may be saying, Michael, that's a lot of speculation. We have nothing to base that on. That is true, it's just something that would roughly work out mathematically. But it works really well for a couple reasons, so let me spell those out. One of the things that's clearly going to be discussed in Bran's story is immortality. He's being tempted with this ability to be an immortal tree god, and he so far doesn't seem super into the idea. Also, George R. R. Martin has stressed that one of the things that he talks about in his book is mortality and that all men must die. He put that in there as the saying of the Faceless Men for a reason. I've also talked about how the House of the Undying, I think, is a pretty clear indication that George is talking about how immortality's not all it's cracked up to be. The Undying are in a hall awash in gloom forever. They're not super happy about the state that they're in, and I think they were freed from that by Daenerys. Whether you think it was intentional by the Undying like I do or not, you can say for sure that they are in a hall awash in gloom and they don't seem super happy. So I think that overall we have a lot of signs pointing towards the idea that George isn't going to have the end point of Bran's story to be that, oh yeah, he embraces immortality and becomes an immortal god king. I think his big thing is he's going to learn to reject the immortality. And he needs a good reason to do that beyond just what he already has. So, as I talked about, if one of the things that Bran's going to be doing on his quest for enlightenment and becoming a good king is going back and looking at history and seeing what he can learn, one of the people he's definitely going to go look at is Bran the Builder. So, we're going to talk about what I think he may see and what he'd learn from that, but the first thing that we need to talk about is another bit of speculation I did in a couple recent videos. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen them, but I talked about how I think the others are shadow babies cast by people who are linked up somehow with Weirwood magic to sustain their life force. It was a whole giant video that got split into two very big videos. They were out recently on the channel if you want to check them out after this. Honestly, a lot of this discussion is follow up to what I talked about in those videos because it popped into my head as I was editing all of that. You don't strictly have to have seen them first, but if it feels like I'm glossing over some points, don't worry, I made them in those videos. You might feel a bit better about what I'm talking about after you've seen them. A good chunk of that second video was dedicated to building a tier list of who I think could be the sources of the others. And the people who made the very top tier were Bran the Builder, the Night's King and the Night's Queen, and Craster's sons. So, I'm sure some of you are realizing the really interesting thing about this theory. If Bran the Builder lived long enough to become the Night's King, well, then suddenly our top tier has shrank quite a bit and things are actually starting to make a lot of sense. If a bunch of the things I've speculated are the case, here's what Bran would see when he goes back into the past. He'll probably start by looking for the last hero, because he's trying to be the new last hero. He's seeking out the aid of the children of the forest to avoid the long night and save the world. Imagine he goes back and finds him, and what do you know, his name is Brandon Stark. That's probably a pretty good sign. And if it's true that the children's weapon in this war was that they were casting others, and Brandon Stark goes out and seeks out the aid of the children of the forest, and then somehow brings about a stalemate, one of the things that I think's pretty reasonable is that they taught him how to cast his own others, or maybe cast others with him. So if he gained this power, just like he's the only one who can speak the Children of the Forest language, he gains access to some of their most powerful magic, well then suddenly he's his own source of others, on the side of humanity. This brings about a stalemate, mutually assured destruction, suddenly the pact, and again the Cold War vibes, right? You build the big wall, you've got the Cold War active forever, there's this big cold weapon in the north that will come back if anyone ever stops following the pact. So Bran the Builder saves humanity, signs the pact, and then because he's the one who's working with the Children of the Forest, his dynasty is put in charge. That's House Stark. He builds Winterfell on an old tree town. The Children of the Forest probably help him establish all of the North, and they're working together for quite a while, as the legends say they did. At this point, it looks like being a Weirwood king with extended life is the perfect thing for Bran to do. But then the thing that's so beautiful about Bran the Builder eventually taking the black at the right time to become the Night King is it fully brings home the whole idea of die the hero or live long enough to become the villain. You either die as Bran the Builder and the last hero, or you live long enough to become the Night's King. And what a good lesson for Bran, who could take all of this power, but needs to learn the lesson that at some point he's going to have to give it up. Watching Bran the Builder fully break bad at the end of his life and have to be put down would also be incredibly interesting, and he could be still locked in the crypts, somehow kept to life, as I've talked about in the past, but watching that entire process play out would be incredible from Bran's perspective and would teach him a lot. Essentially, this would mean that in this time there was really only one guy who had all of this magical capability to cast others and the knowledge to do so. It's just that in his later life he met someone else, a woman who was able to also help him with this magic, who tempted him into trying to take power again in some dark way. Perhaps he wasn't actually fully immortal, and as the last bit of his long life was fading away, he was tempted by this corpse queen to go for the full thing, take full immortality, and rule as the Night's King. This could be the final form of Bran the Builder. And the crazy thing about it is this would also explain why they wiped the Night's King's name from history. Because they can't ruin the myth of Bran the Builder. This is like freaking the Dark Knight, when they have to turn Two-Face's face over at the end and show his good side rather than his burn side. They can't tell all of the people of Gotham that their hero broke bad. They need to cover it up forever if they can. And that could be what they did with the Night's King. This would explain why they had to go so far as wiping his name from the history books, because they can't let anyone remember what Bran the Builder ended up doing. The mythological importance of the last hero, Bran the Builder, the founder of House Stark, the guy who built the wall and basically built this culture that exists in Westeros, well, that myth is far too important to the culture for them to destroy it by letting them know that it turned out to be evil in the end. This would work especially well if it ends up being the case that, yeah, this entire Old Ways culture and all the blood sacrifice and blood magic is indeed a problem in the end. Basically, you have the same thing that's going on with the entire Old Ways happen with the founder of it, Bran the Builder. He's painted in a much nicer light to all of our characters that we're in the point of views of, up until the big reveal that it turns out, oh no, there's actually a lot of issues with this whole system and with what Bran the Builder did. If this is true, it's probably even the case that the old ways, like Bran the Builder, may have started out with entirely good intentions and trying to do what's best for the world, but Bran's gonna learn what happens to a person and to a way of life if it doesn't let go when its time is up. That desire to hold on to power can cause some pretty dark things to happen. How crazy would it be if Bran follows old Nan's stories that he was told about the last hero seeking the aid of the children of the forest, and he looks back into the past and watches from the time that the last hero sides with the children of the forest and saves the world, all the way up to the point where he refuses to die and won't let go of his power, and therefore drives the world into another near long night type event because he either won't let go of his power or won't let go of his hold on life. It would teach Bran a perfect lesson, it would be a crazy twist, it would make perfect sense for Bran to go back and view that, and it would honestly be a pretty nice, concise way for him to learn that from viewing the ancient history. As much as we do want Bran to be going back and looking at everything so that we can learn a lot of cool stuff, George does need to wrap this up in 2 books, so if Bran can learn everything that he needs to know from watching the life of one character in the ancient history, well, that's a pretty convenient solution. If you want Bran's lesson to be that he should take this magical power and use it to save humanity, but then he should set down the power rather than become an immortal king who tries to rule forever, well, that's a really quick way to try and get the message across where Bran only has to go back into the past and view the story of one character who happens to also be named Bran. So hopefully now you can see why I said this is a theory that is, yes, very speculative, but it's also something that lines up so well and works so well that it might, in my opinion, be what George is going for. It's not so much that we have a ton of textual clues pointing towards it, it's just that all of the textual context that we have makes it work pretty well. So, since I'm thinking about this, I would like to speculate a little bit further about the details of how maybe this could have played out if indeed this is what happened. Because we still do have several interesting questions to try and figure out. How long was Bran the Builder's life? Was he truly fully immortal? If so, where did he end up? Or if he died at some point, where did his body end up? There's a lot of really interesting questions that I feel like in this context become even more interesting. Like the prime question of where exactly is Bran the Builder's body? If he died as the Night King and he was there at the Night Fort, maybe they did just freeze him into the wall if he was strapped up in the roots of that giant heart tree that may now be the Black Gate. That seems like something that would, on some level, make sense. You have this immortal figure who's caused a lot of problems, but he's also your family member, so you don't necessarily want to kill him. So maybe you just freeze the wall around him where he'll no longer be a big problem, and he'll no longer be able to communicate with his icy queen who's casting all of these shadow monsters and causing you issues. I could see some sort of situation like that going down if George did want to have the big climactic reveal of what's going on take place at the Night Fort. We've also talked many times on the channel how there is a lot of setup for the idea of bodies just being shoved into the wall and frozen there as punishment, both with Arson Isaacs and the 79 Sentinels. I feel like that's definitely going to come back on some level or another, and there will be some relevant bodies in the wall. Is it going to be under this exact circumstance we're talking about? I don't really know. But alternatively, and I think even slightly a little more likely, is that they probably took his body and brought it down to the crypts of Winterfell where all of the Starks are supposed to rest. But if he is immortal and somehow, sustained down there by Weirwood magic, well then maybe they would have had to basically trap him and lock him in the crypts, so that he never gets out and starts causing more of these problems. There is definitely a vibe that there is something being held magically deep down in the crypts of Winterfell, right? You have these old kings of winter holding their iron swords across their laps, supposedly to trap the spirits of the old kings of winter down in the crypts. And that sounds pretty much exactly like what would be going on if Bran the Builder's body was magically, somehow still alive deep down in the crypts and he needs to be held there by magic, and maybe that's why there must always be a Stark in Winterfell so that, he's always guarded and he can never start causing these sort of long night others type problems again. I could definitely see something like that going on if Bran the Builder did indeed break bad at the end of his life. If he remained a good guy and the founder of House Stark and the savior of humanity or whatever, well, then it makes sense that you would guard him down there in the crypts whether he's still alive or not. Either you're guarding the body of your founder, who's very important to you, or if he's still strapped up into the Weirwood tree and is magically important to the Stark's power and remaining in power for 10,000 years, well, then yeah, you're obviously going to guard that center of your power. So if Bran the Builder wasn't the Night King, it only makes sense that he would be down there in the crypts of Winterfell. But even if he was the Night King, I could see a situation where they may have wanted to bring his body back, whether immortal or not, and put it down in the crypts rather than leaving it somewhere up near the wall. The other interesting thing that's an aspect of this, if Bran the Builder was indeed the Night King and then he was defeated, is how did things go with the Corpse Queen in the end? Was this a situation where he had fully given in to this dark power that he was trying to take with the Corpse Queen and trying to rule forever as an immortal Night King? Or was it a situation where he was tempted by this power, but then when he was attacked eventually by the Stark in Winterfell, who would have been his son or grandson or pretty close descendant at that point, and Jorman from Beyond the Wall, was this interaction with his descendant able to sort of pull him back from the brink, right? Did he maybe break up with the Corpse Queen and help lock her beyond the wall? Thus, sort of giving her this sort of revenge and heartbreak motivation to try and get to the crypts and kill this frickin' guy. That would certainly rhyme with the story we have of Jon going north of the wall, falling in love with Ygritte, and eventually, due to duty and circumstances and trying to not have the world taken over by others, he has to break up with her and she proceeds to march down trying to get south of the wall to freaking kill him. We definitely have a lot of situations where the actions of our modern day characters are mirroring the actions of mythological characters from the history, so maybe this is just another example. Realistically, if there is a Corpse Queen, Knight's Queen type figure out there who's casting the others that we see today, I think she's going to have some sort of personal revenge motivation. This is one of those things that I brought up in that previous video about the others. I think that she's like a grand, immortal, magical Stoneheart type figure. She is very upset about the things that were done to her and her family so long ago, and now she wants revenge on all of humanity in the same way that Catelyn wants revenge on all of the Freys. George R. R. Martin loves to write stories about heartbreak and these personal conflicts, so I think that this big others conflict being the result of a giant revenge cycle that sprung out of something like this, it makes a lot of sense and it's very George R. R. Martin. So basically, my question is if Bran the Builder was this Night's King, did he side with her all the way to the end? And then therefore she's upset that he was taken back to Winterfell and trapped in the crypts and she wants to free him so that they can go back to, doing whatever they were doing together. Or did he break up with her and lock her beyond the wall, and now she is freaking pissed at her ex-husband? Basically, are they locking Bran the Builder down in the crypts to keep him away from this immortal woman who's there and could cast terrible shadows with him? Or are they keeping him down there to protect him from his angry ex-wife? Both of those would work pretty well and be very interpersonal conflicts the way that I think George R. R. Martin would want this to be. There's literally an interview clip where George is asked about writing what you know, and he said, well, how was I supposed to do that? I don't know anything about fantasy or sci fi really when I was just a young writer, but the one thing that he did know was heartbreak. So all of his stories became about people getting their hearts broken amongst the stars. And if heartbreak is at the core of this story as well, that would be very George R. R. Martin. Given the way that George talks about the issue, it wouldn't really surprise me if some form of heartbreak like this was at the core of his story. We see a lot of heartbreak at the core of what's going on with the feuding gods in Elden Ring, so if there are feuding ancient figures who are immortal and causing issues to this day, I would imagine there could be some heartbreak involved. So once again, we're coming to a situation where you can see this is incredibly speculative, but when you think about it, it's just so gosh dang George R. R. Martin, and the little bit of setup that we do have around the Corpse Queen, the Night's King, Bran the Builder, who should in theory have his life extended, and the timing being about right where maybe he would give up his power for his descendants at the right time to be the 13th Lord Commander. It just all kind of fits, and it would make it so that there only really needs to be one ancient Stark figure who was capable of bringing about others. And that also does sort of make the timeline of the ancient past a little bit neater. So, yeah, as I said, this is something that I feel like is worth speculating about. Another thing that I feel like it could be worth bringing up, but I don't know how seriously you take these numbers, is we're told that there have been nearly 1,000 Lord Commanders, and at one point during the Harvest Feast, Bran thinks that they're not cheering for him, they're cheering for all the Starks going back 8,000 years. So if roughly you've had 8,000 years of the Stark dynasty and 1,000 Lord Commanders, that means that every Lord Commander on average is roughly 8 years. So, by that math, you get the 13th Lord Commander taking his seat roughly 96 years after the wall was built. Assuming that the Night's Watch wasn't founded at some point during the construction, you could maybe shorten that a little bit if it took 20 years to finish building the wall and they were ruling from the wall before that. It doesn't really matter. I think that it's safe to say it was just a bit under a century, or at most roughly a century after the wall was built, that the Night's King was the Lord Commander. So this is about how long you would think Bran the Builder would have his life extended if you expect him to potentially have ever ended up as the Night's King. Definitely a thing outside of the edge of plausibility when you're talking about a normal lifespan, but considering the lifespans we see extended in various ways throughout this series, whether it's Melisandre who's practiced her art for years beyond count, or as I said, all those bodies that are strapped up to the Weirwoods that have been alive for who knows how long, there are many ways around this that I think Bran the Builder would have had access to. The other thing that's sort of interesting about this is what it says about power and this magical power in George's world, right? Because last episode on the channel we talked about how this seems like it's sort of an archetype, where when someone tries to take this shadow magic power, someone else has to become powerful enough to defeat them, and then they become the shadow chaser, save the world, the last hero sort of figure. Well, it is definitely an interesting statement for George to be making if what he says at the end is basically like, hey, the thing that you need to defeat this powerful bad guy is for a good guy to take power. But how do you decide if that good guy who's taking the same power and using it to do what he wants is actually good? Well, maybe part of the way is that eventually that good guy will set down the power and let other people have their freedom back. He maybe takes the power to free the people, and then when it comes time to either control them or set down the power, he sets it down and lets them do what they will. If it is indeed the case that Bran isn't going to become an immortal god king that can mind read and control everyone and become fully evil, he needs to learn that lesson somewhere, and I think Bran the Builder is just the most reasonable place for him to learn that lesson. So either he's going to have to watch how Bran the Builder set down the power and learn that that was the right thing to do by example, or maybe he's going to watch him not do that and learn why it's not the right thing to do by example. Even just look at the late seasons of the television show. They just pretty much directly told us this is what's going on some level, because Daenerys, yes, she comes in and she saves the world, but then what is the thing that causes Jon to eventually have to kill her? It's when she doesn't put down the power, she keeps trying to dominate more and more and more, and then the words that doom her are when she says, they don't get to choose. You can see how this is a similar progression that shows taking the power that you need to save the world in the first place is a dangerous thing. And maybe they thought because they were getting this across with Daenerys, they didn't need to have Bran going back and looking into the past into characters who the TV show viewers would have no idea who they were. They definitely cut out a lot of the mental magic and the Weirwood magic with Bran's storyline, so I could see them wanting to streamline things in this way. But I think in the books, what's going to be happening is Bran is going to be going back into the ancient past and learning a bunch of these lessons, and then he's going to come back and look at the real world and realize that a bunch of people are making the same mistakes now, and he's going to come in and fix the mess. I think that we can see this temptation for greater shadow magic power and eventually immortality sprinkled throughout all of these books, and I think Bran is on a crash course to dealing with it in The Winds of Winter and A Dream of Spring. Dany's failure seemingly was this inability to put down her own power after she became powerful enough to save the world. You could sort of call it the last hero to Night's King pipeline, basically. Like the idea that you take this power and potentially save the world, but if you become immortal and don't eventually die, you would eventually just become too powerful and become a sort of Night's King type figure. Well, I think that does have a lot going for it thematically, and it could teach Bran a lot. So, while I don't necessarily know if I firmly believe this is going to be what Bran goes back and sees, I think that it does have a lot going for it. It's something that I might have to go back and look for more foreshadowing on and think about as I do future rereads. Also, if we do want to go just one level of tinfoil deeper before we end here, there is always that idea that's been out there in the fandom that Bran is either the Night King or he's all the Brans in the past or all the relevant Brans, and on some level or another, he's fixing his own mess when he's having to clean up this problem. I could definitely also see this being the easy path to that, right? Basically, he goes back into the past and does a trial run. He could go back to the first long night and essentially Hodor his way into someone, and then that person could become the last hero, allowing Bran to basically, in dream and past form, go through the motions of all of this and try and figure out what he's going to do. If you're inclined to believe that Bran is all the Brans or the source of the others on some level or another, essentially what could happen is that his trial run ends with him trying to hold on to this power and all of this ability and be Bran the Builder forever and live out all his dreams, become the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, do all this stuff. But then eventually he decides, you know what I want to do? I want to get married to that hot woman over there and become more magically powerful. Right? Eventually he gives into the temptation, and eventually that's what throws this entire thing off. teaching our modern day Bran, whether it was him actually living through that Bran in the past or just watching, teaching him the lesson of, yeah, you need to eventually let go of this power, let go of your hold on life, and let somebody else take up the seat of power. The debate as to whether Bran is just going to watch the ancient past and sort of guide through the wind in the trees, or whether he's going to be full on Hodoring his way into ancient figures in the past, isn't something that I have a firm opinion on one way or the other. I could definitely see George playing with this either way, and I'd be interested to hear what you guys think of it down in the comments, as well as everything else that I've talked about in this video. Considering I just sort of started thinking about this idea, I'm sure this is one that I'll be revisiting sort of the way I did with the others as Shadow Babies, where I sort of put out the idea and then a year later I came back having looked over the books again with the idea in mind and made a more firm case. So maybe when I do the same thing for this idea, I'll decide that yeah, this makes quite a bit of sense and I'll come back to it, or maybe I'll find some problems with it. And maybe you can all help me out with either of those things down in the comments. Thank you all very much for watching. Remember to like and subscribe, share the video with someone who may enjoy it, and I'll be back with something else very soon.